he was in no position to judge.
Welcome back. I can't remember a situation where there were 4 or 5 sides of an argument and everybody in this argument, they have a point that I absolutely understand, but everybody wrong. Because we're talking about the Venezuelan migrants and the refugee crisis in our country. The cut and dry of it. If you are a migrant coming to a country illegally, it is wrong. There are legal ways to enter any country, and think about last year when Trinidad and Tobago had to implement a visa system after the migrant registration process. And with our borders closed, it is arguably much harder. But
large numbers of Venezuelans ended up in Trinidad and Tobago. We first saw Venezuelans coming here mainly calling themselves students. Remember that? You'd see a handful of students in Woodbrook, and then there was a few came looking for jobs. And as the word gets back to Venezuela that there's some relief in Trinidad and Tobago, that became a pull factor. The government looked at the situation. We kept the borders open to Venezuela, that system of coming and going, until we had to take a decision when the numbers became a different set of numbers.
And before you start to cut my head off, we absolutely know why we are doing this. We did a whole segment on the state of Venezuela. It is a mess. This is why they're coming.
Years of corruption, mismanagement, and economic sanctions have decimated the oil industry, this OPEC's nation main source of income. The government is finding it difficult to provide gas, water, and fuel to its people because infrastructure is crumbling across the country. A months-long coronavirus lockdown is complicating the economic situation even further. For many, it's too late for protests. They're seeing a future across the border.
And that border could mean Colombia's by land or ours by sea. Look, no one ever put their children in a pirogue unless things were really bad. They're being sent off in search of a better life, not even knowing whether or not they'd be able to achieve it. Ask Superman. He went through it. And, while I do like Superman, there is a reason why Jonathan and Martha Kent kept his immigration status quiet. Well, a few reasons. But if you take out the emotions for a second, it is still wrong.
Emotions must never be one of the criteria for decision making, You know that? Careful with your emotional status at this time, Marlon. I can see the tear in your eye.
I could call the name of one person in the police service that is always emotional,
So saying, he's been oddly quiet. But in this rare moment, the senior soup was right.
Borders are locked to our citizens, Marlon. You calling for persons from Canada to come home. Mm-hmm. But a man could jump on a boat, have sympathy with persons, and take up 2 children and come and have all your crying. And all you're not seeing the big picture, Marlon. If, for some reason, persons are taking this pandemic seriously, and persons are coming in without the proper protocol, well then, I expect the worst.
And we've already seen one of those migrants test positive for COVID-19. So these wrongs lead us to the next wrong. Our government, for years, they have dragged their feet on coming up with a proper refugee policy. One that would incorporate some of the UN charters that we signed on to with our actual ability to host refugees and asylum seekers.
The government of Trinidad and Tobago is not prepared to open any refugee camp in Trinidad and Tobago to please anybody except the people of Trinidad and Tobago. And any reference to any shortcoming with respect to other obligations, our primary obligation is to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, and we have done so.
Supplemental member for Princess Town.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. To the Honourable Prime Minister. Prime Minister, in this very Parliament, a few months ago, the Honourable Attorney General indicated that there was a policy before the Cabinet with respect to refugees. Can you tell us when that policy will be completed and presented to the people of Trinidad and Tobago?
Madam Speaker, the business of Cabinet will come to the public on completion of any such business. Other than that, Madam Speaker, the business of cabinet is circumscribed by secrecy.
And that was on the last day of the Venezuelan registration. Prime Minister was hammered on this by the opposition. And a year later, there is still no clear answer.
At this stage, we have a number of decisions to make. The one thing I think I will get cabinet support from is an extension of the Venezuelan migration, the Venezuelan registration migrants. And I think we will be heading towards requiring persons to fill out a form that they want to continue in this process. Not that there will be any new persons allowed to register whatsoever. We are not allowing any further registration of any new persons.
And I get it. Lots of times you sign on to these UN charters the way you sign a birthday card for that coworker that you really don't like. Even if you don't want to, you think, it's not legally binding. And most importantly, you don't want to look like a dick if you didn't. But what is becoming painfully obvious, that as the registration process came to an end, the situation in Venezuela wasn't getting any better. And it really was the time to come up with some laws that protected our sovereignty, because continuously repeating, well, after the registration period is over, anybody found here illegally will be deported, is not strong enough, as we're learning today.
According to a statement issued by the opposition today, there continues to be limits and gaps within the law. The UNC contends that a well-developed refugee policy should be the first undertaking of a joint select committee on foreign affairs. The opposition added that the current refugee policy is based on the Prime Minister's reactions to ongoing events. However, according to the Attorney General, the UNC's call fails to take several critical elements into account, including COVID-19 and the country's economic status.
And I hate that you are making Rodney Charles make sense, because the AG's response to accusations of making policy based solely on current events was to give examples of current events affecting policy. And the Prime Minister and Stuart Young, finding themselves in this position, continue to say all the wrong things that just kind of make them look really heartless.
When quizzed about the state's return of children, he said he could give no guarantee about their well-being and instead questioned the parents who put their children aboard a vessel for an illegal trip. He then admitted he was in no position to judge.
But that has to take us now to the United Nations and all of these other human rights groups, the UNHCR, UNONR, IACHR, all these groups that sound like my mother trying to figure out what her email password is. These organizations start to sound like these pro-life groups. Hey, abortion is bad, but are you going to raise my baby? No. So we get the human rights angle. But the UN isn't a country. I can't say, oh, the refugees are staying in the UN, and they're also not a government that actually has to distribute already limited resources to a people. What they're doing is sitting down in their offices and issuing these press releases and guilting people to take on certain situations that, especially in our case, we are not equipped to handle.
UN spokesperson Liz Russell says in a statement, "We are deeply concerned at the decision by Trinidad and Tobago to deport 16 Venezuelan children and 9 adults at the same time as an application was being lodged against their removal."
Russell says the best interests of the child must be a primary consideration in all decisions affecting them. Children should never be forcibly deported based on their or their parents' migration status.
And at the end of the day, we have to look at the other problem, because what is happening here is being exacerbated by crippling sanctions implemented by the US. Sanctions, I must say, do not always hurt the people that they're intended to, and most of the times that's the leaders, Maduro. In most cases, it's the people who suffer.
Ambassador Mondalo says it is Maduro and his backers, not sanctions, who are to blame for the millions of Venezuelans living in dire economic conditions and who have fled their homes since he assumed power. He says the United States will continue to work with Trinidad and Tobago to help mitigate the consequences of this crisis.
Ambassador Joseph Mondalo really is something. This guy just cannot keep his nose out of things.
Mr. Mondalo, hush your mouth, please.
That's when you don't have a visa renewal coming up. But it does bring me to Maduro. For the love of, come on, man, Mr. Maduro. If you love the people so much, you have to start taking steps to make life easier for them. You cannot keep tackling the issue of people calling you a dictator by doing dictator things.
Missing from the ballot are Venezuela's principal opposition parties. They've decided to boycott the polls, citing probable fraud. With the mainstream opposition refusing to take part in elections that they say will be rigged, Venezuelans who once voted overwhelmingly for change are apathetic and immoral. But for embattled President Maduro, reclaiming the National Assembly will send a clear message that he is firmly in power, at least for the time being.
He's not helping anyone but yourself, and millions of people are suffering because of it. But you know what? Let's come back home, because there's still a lot of wrong happening there. The UNC. This is the same UNC who in 2019 was begging the government, ordering, close the borders. And then they unleashed Kia on us. Yeah, I'm not going to forget that. To protest on the final day of the migrant registration.
Hold up. You know why it is not sufficient? This is not about the, as I said, hold up people, as I said clearly before, this is not just about that immigrant issue. This is the most incompetent government ever. This has nothing to do only with Venezuela, as the news and the stations trying to paint.
Now, as much as you may say, oh no, they weren't connected, look at what happens when Kamala Persad-Bissessar arrives at the parliament. And if you listen carefully, the rhetoric sounds pretty similar.
So there's a lot of anger in the society out there, and the government seems to be totally incompetent and unaware. They seem to be in a bubble, in a cloud somewhere. They seem to be very unaware of the anger, the pain and suffering in the country at this time.
I just say it. But now you're crying crocodile tears?
We may be implementing our laws. We cannot undermine the rule of law. Once they're in our country, their matters are before the court. They are protected by the laws of our country. I am sure that every citizen of Trinidad and Tobago, of every faith, creed, or race, would want these children to be cared for and loved in the same way that we treat our own children.
And this is where the government is wrong again, because well, without a proper policy, everything is playing out in the courts, where the opposition always navigates better. But give me a break. Where was that compassion in the parliament last year?
Before Orpuchis.
Is the Prime Minister aware that it have more people at the Oval today than for a test match? No.
Keep, right? Everything is a joke. And finally, you, Trinidad and Tobago, you Trinis, you think you don't have some blame to take for this?
Prime Minister said something yesterday, and I'm agreeing with him. Immigration issues, migrant crisis, it's a lucrative business. From the boatman who run in, who charging them, from the lawyers who getting paid to represent them, from the Trinis who are renting to them, from the vet, it's everybody. It's a lucrative business, it really is. And let me tell you something, I am of the firm belief as of yesterday, after speaking with the Prime Minister, that this situation is going to be more difficult to deal with than I anticipated because of you same Trinidadian nationals who are helping the Venezuelans to come here illegally. You.
And all those xenophobic comments, come on, when half of y'all have an undocumented aunt somewhere in the Upper East Side taking care of somebody, baby, rest me now. In conclusion, everybody wrong. Let's take a break.